Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Chris Buckley and Jake Skrzypiec, two classroom teachers and human rights educators in Connecticut. Chris is a social studies teacher at Brookfield, Connecticut High School, while Jake teaches social studies at Manchester, Connecticut High School. Chris and Jake are joined by Kevin Maysonnet, a June 2023 graduate of Manchester High School and currently a freshman at Fordham University, and Shirin Unvala, a senior at Brian McMahon Global Studies High School in Norwalk, Connecticut. In this episode, Chris, Jake, Kevin, and Shirin discuss the origins of their interest in human rights, their work with human rights close to home, a K-12 university project headquartered at the University of Connecticut, and the challenges they encounter when seeking to integrate HRE into school programs. Well, I'm very pleased to welcome today to our conversation Jake Skrzypiec from Manchester High School in Manchester, Connecticut, Chris Buckley, a faculty member at Brookfield High School in Brookfield, Connecticut, Kevin Maysonnet, a graduated senior from Manchester High School who will be going to Fordham University starting in September of 2023, and Shirin Unvala, who is a senior at Brian McMahon Global Studies High School in Norwalk, Connecticut. Welcome to all of you to Human Rights Education Now, and it's a pleasure to be with you. So what I'd like to do is start our conversation by just asking a question, and I'm going to ask you to answer in sequence. So why don't we just start with Jake, and that is, what initially inspired you to take an interest in human rights issues?
So what initially inspired me to take an interest in human rights issues was, I think, my teacher prep program. It was very much concentrated in World War II and Holocaust studies. That was kind of the lens and the focus that we did a lot of our teacher prep around. And I think from there, after doing some really deep and rigorous work in, at UConn and in college around that, I found a natural entry point into, human rights education and dedicating myself to advancing human rights ed. I had an opportunity to work on a project with the Edward Kennedy Center where we designed a government simulation, a Senate simulation around children's rights. And from there, I was able to work with other partners and really connect with some leading scholars and educators in the field. And I found that taking up opportunity with notable people in the field was a really inspiring and empowering thing to do. And from there, I kind of dedicated myself as a human rights educator and a social studies educator.
Chris, go right ahead.
Yeah, so kind of a little different than Jake. I found myself getting connected because many of the issues in human rights education were things that were, in my practice as an educator, impacting my kids. I advised student government in both my previous building in Darien and now in Brookfield. And given the opportunity to bring in guest speakers, I found that the ones that were most meaningful to my students and to issues that were, impacting education are also human rights issues. We ended up bringing a gentleman named Jamie Nabosny, who's an LGBTQ activist, now going back almost 15 years, and that, led me into saying, well, this is important for kids, but it also is a defense of their rights, and they need to be able to be activists on their own behalf. And that really was my entry point into looking at the other aspects of human rights that were impacting particularly young people. And then as my career in this has unfolded, clearly adults and more broadly, but really it started with things that were important to my kids.
Evan?
Right. I suppose what really led myself to immerse myself in human rights was COVID in a way. I was always interested in politics. Like ever since I watched the 2016 election unfolding on my TV, I've always been fascinated with it. But if you do follow politics, it's not an uplifting subject per se. And when COVID hit, especially, like conversation between everyone kind of broke down, and the world felt really divided and honestly pretty bleak. And then the very first class I took in person after COVID was a human rights summer enrichment course at Manchester High School. And this was before my sophomore year. We talked about how we could improve our communities through like concrete action. And, as cliche as it sounds, like we can really change the world with human rights if we really put our efforts into upholding them. Like all the problems that I saw in the news, from racism to economic inequality, they all seem difficult, but like no longer impossible to mitigate. And that's pretty much how I got interested in human rights.
Shirin?
So my entry point into human rights, I would say, probably began last year when I was a sophomore in high school. It was when I was taking my civics course, which is a requirement for all high school students that go to the Center for Global Studies in Norwalk. And from there, I kind of, was understanding how bills are passed, bills are formed, kind of the thought process behind all of that. And also we did a little bit of research into different countries and how their legislative system kind of works. And so that's where my entry point kind of began. And then earlier this year, in wake of the protests in Iran in wake of Mahsa Amini's really unfortunate death, that's really what kind of struck, I think, a passion or sort of like a specific category of human rights for me, which is like women's rights. So that really became a big focus point in my human rights journey, I guess you could say.
Now, you've all mentioned that you came to human rights through something related to formal education. But there's quite a bit of evidence that public schools in the United States are not, for lack of a better term, comfortable many times with human rights issues. So would any of you like to comment on how you've tried to make your experience more meaningful, given that in some places there actually open hostility to human rights?
So I'll kind of weigh in. I think that that open hostility has to kind of be taken on in a way that almost presents HRE to a community or school in a pretty palatable and acceptable way. And what I mean by that is I think that schools, teachers, other stakeholders in the community should be able to see that human rights ed is something that all, no matter what your political affiliation, no matter what your identity might be, that it is important for all students to have. So again, in Manchester Public Schools, we've made our human rights class a graduation requirement, which is actually pretty rare. That's a unique opportunity for students. There are challenges that come with that. We've gone through a lot of challenges to make sure that that universal experience is as meaningful as possible for all students. But I would say after years of running a graduation required human rights class, we've had upwards of 3,500 students who've graduated our halls who are now, I think, even in a small way, better prepared to take on the challenges of the world beyond high school. And so for me, that's a win, right? I don't think that's maybe a model for every district. I don't think I could say that every town and city in the country should make a human rights class a graduation requirement. I would love that. But I think that that might be a possible solution to get after some of that hostility and challenge that might exist in communities.
Go ahead, Chris.
Bill, to build on that, I think, the hostility in my mind comes from a misunderstanding of what human rights in general and human rights education is, and that there's a misconception that these are political concepts that we're discussing, where in reality these are inherent rights, for everyone, regardless of your political affiliation. And so I think, part of where the backlash and that you reference comes from is community members who don't quite understand that human rights education is just really education, right? That we're taking care of our young people in a way that reflects their dignity and their individuality and their right to grow up in a safe environment with full understanding of who they are as individuals. And I think that that's, for me, a big part of in the work that I do here with Jake and with Kevin and Shirin, and then with RFK Human Rights. It's the idea that giving educators talking points so that they understand that really what you're doing is just teaching kids. And if you're doing it right, then you're actually doing human rights education. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's the through part, right? The through and the for, not necessarily the content, that I think is as important aspect of human rights education, as opposed in addition to, clearly we want them to know their rights and teach those things, but how they behave, what they do with their knowledge after the activism component, I think is equally as important and also misunderstood.
Kevin or Shirin, you want to speak on that? Go ahead, Shirin.
I mean, just to kind of like echo what Mr. Buckley and Mr. Skrzypiec are saying, I think a lot of times people get confused if like human rights is part of like some sort of political agenda, and it's really not. I mean, in its purest form, it really is, rights for all, and it's important for everyone to kind of be aware of their rights, because how can you defend something you're not aware of? And so I think that's a huge aspect to it. And obviously with politics and human rights, there are obviously intersections, and those do exist, but it's important to kind of realize that, like I said, at its core, it's not something that is, left or right. It's for everyone.
Go ahead, Kevin.
One issue I found, even with the mandatory human rights credit, which I absolutely love, some students I found amongst my peers feel like human rights isn't necessarily that grounded, and it isn't that concrete. And like there's this sentiment that it's sort of lofty ideas thrown around in the classroom. But like through my work, especially with human rights close to home, which I'll talk about more later, like I've learned just how like concrete it is. And I've really been trying to like hone in on that in all my discussions amongst my peers when I was in Manchester High School. Like it is very concrete, and like there are many very good things that you can do with human rights. It's not just lofty ideas. It's very important, and like it genuinely brings about positive impact on communities.
Well, that's a nice segue into how we connect what you're talking about to the program in Connecticut, Human Rights Close to Home. So I'd like Chris and Jake to start out, and then both of you, Shirin and Kevin, to talk about that.
Sure, yeah. So Human Rights Close to Home is a program being run through the University of Connecticut. For me personally, my work with UConn has come through primarily the early college experience program here, the ECE program, which is a program at UConn that provides college credits to high school kids for high school credits that are essentially dual enrolled. UConn provides a human rights intro to human rights course that I and Jake are certified teachers in. So I became connected with that program through my work as a lead educator for RFK. I'd come to UConn a number of times to lead teacher training workshops here at the Dodd Center with Glenn Matoma. And that kind of segued into teaching the course, which segued into becoming an educational consultant and being asked to be on the steering committee for this program, which is designed to increase the human rights education footprint in the state. So for me, getting connected to human rights close to home has to do with some of the other work as an educator that I've been doing, and very humbled to be asked to be a part of the work that UConn and the state are doing when it comes to increasing access.
Yeah, and I would just add on, I think Human Rights Close to Home has really been a much longer term project than just in the last 2 years. There's been quite a deal of even just informal conversations that have been happening for a number of years now around how do we make sure that both young people and teachers have the tools to both understand how they can be educated about for and through human rights, but also take civic action in their communities. And so this project, what's exciting to me about it is that this is kind of a lot of different pieces that have been going on in Connecticut. This is the fruition of that. Chris and I have had conversations with some of the lead stakeholders for a number of years now on what can we do next? How can we keep elevating human rights ed and civic action? And this has been a really fantastic project to be part of, because it's been kind of like every little step we've taken. I think this is kind of the culminating type of experience we would have dreamed about 10 years ago or so. Really, the objectives and the goals of the program are bringing Connecticut teachers, bringing Connecticut youth together for a number of different programs, some academic year programs, but the main heart of it is a 2-week summer institute that's funny enough going on right now, where young people and teachers are in workshops together, dialoguing with one another, engaging and thinking about how they can build curriculum and how they can build civic action plans and take that back to their communities. It's a lot of different elements put together, but I would say what's really, really empowering is to see young people and adults in partnership with one another. We don't regularly see that out in the world. And so I think this is a really exciting and a model that it has so many possibilities moving forward.
And Bill, if I could just add.
Yeah, just to be specific, I would just like to add the question, can you give us some numbers or how many districts and people approximately are involved?
Yeah, I believe there's about 8 districts locally connected with UConn. These are partnership districts that UConn already kind of has close connections with. And there was a selection process, a recruitment and selection process to recruit, for this summer at least, 25 educators, not just social studies teachers, but kindergarten through 12th grade, all different subject areas. So really, again, across the gamut of public education. And then 15 young people from some of those similar partnership districts to, again, be in workshops and to be working together for the Summer Institute.
And also to build on that, the participants, as Jake, I think, kind of mentioned, that this is a multi-year process, so that there's a commitment level that they're, for our young people working on projects that they're going to go back to their schools, continue to work on over the course of the year and come back. And so this is not a one and done process, but an engaging process to work on the activism component, the engagement component about actually making change. And same with our colleagues going through the process right now. This is designed to not be something that somebody takes back to their classroom and only impacts, the 25 to 100 kids, depending on what level you teach, lucky enough to have you, but that there would be a ripple effect going out where that would impact your broader community. And I think it's emblematic of what's going on in the state of Connecticut, in that UConn, as the flagship university, is not only receptive but supportive and actively promoting the inclusion of human rights education in public education, and that the state itself is doing that. I mean, we have our state has a Black and Latino studies course that's a requirement that has to be offered in every high school across the state, and that promotes the idea that human rights is an integral part of education. And I don't know if all states do that. So the fact that our state has that gives, I think, educators like Jake and myself, and then young people like Kevin and Shirin, the opportunity to see where human rights can fit and into their lives and then go beyond.
Shirin, you want to add?
I mean, about like the summit, or about like our job?
Just about your experience at the workshops and the things that you've done with this program.
Yeah, so I was first, like I said, approached by my civics teacher, and he nominated me to kind of join this team. And I sat in on the first Zoom meeting and I was like, wow, this seems really interesting. And so I gave it a go. And I've been a part of the team for like 2 years now. And a lot of my job is kind of in relation to our youth summit, which we put on yearly, in which, Mr. Buckley and Mr. Skrzypiec were talking about having 8 different districts of high school students, like maybe around like 100 students, attend like a human rights day at UConn where we have people from nonprofits speak. They get to engage in activities and overall like up their awareness on human rights. So I've kind of been a big, my role has been big on like themes. So we have, to give you a few examples of last year's themes, we have youth action and awareness, creative storytelling, the idea of being able to convey a culture or, an ideology or some sort of, that type of thing through storytelling, let it be through dance or art or whatever. And then nonlinear thinking, so kind of thinking outside the box in a way that you can understand where human rights is like this interconnected type of thing. So not just seeing things as isolated variables, but how environment and race and gender and, all of these factors kind of are at play with one another. So those are just a few of the themes that we had this last summit. But it's also been great to kind of get to work with Kevin. We've been on the team for, the longest and kind of exchange ideas and, how can we make this experience really just like beneficial and fun and informational for these high school students.
So Kevin, and then I'm going to come back to you, Shirin, to talk about how you then take what you've learned at the Summer Institute and bring it back and work with other students in the district.
Well, like I joined with the HRCH when Mr. Skrzypiec after my summer enrichment course that I took in that I mentioned before over the summer, I went into my sophomore year and I immediately took a college level human rights course, and it was led by Mr. Skrzypiec, and it was a very interesting course, and I was approached by Mr. Skrzypiec eventually, and I was invited to join this, and as Shirin mentioned, like it's a group of students like us, and we coordinated like all the logistics, all the events, all the ideas that eventually comprise the youth summit. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to attend much of the Summer Institute, but from what I could see immediately, just as soon as I entered the building and I saw like the high school students there, they're all just very fascinated with like the whole human rights perspective. And like I was very proud to help them with some ideas of theirs and like concentrate that into some like specific ideas, some specific projects that they really want to take part in.
So now, Shirin, going back to your school next year, you'll be a senior. How do you see this impacting your daily work with other people?
So, yeah, being a senior is like, huge step, one step before college. And in terms of this program, I think that I'm still very much committed to it. I'm still gonna, work on the program and see what I can do. But yeah, just kind of as a senior, I guess this whole program has also really shaped my idea of what do I want to do post high school? What kind of major am I looking at? And I think human rights is definitely a part of that. And, I've had like many of conversations with my dad of, what kind of field can I go into and what kind of direction does this offer me? And, I'm trying to view it more as like human rights can really appear in anything. So you don't really necessarily need to go into human rights as just this like one idea. You can maybe go into healthcare or go into gender studies or race, etc. So there's so many avenues that I'm looking at currently, but yeah, this program has for sure shaped my my path and how I consider that in the future.
So to be paraphrasing that, it's like your worldview has been changed. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now back to Jake and Chris. It seems to me that this program in Connecticut is really a model for many other states if they wanted to apply it. Recognizing that none of these ideas that you have clearly are necessarily going to be totally accepted by other people. So I'd like you to discuss some of the challenges or obstacles that you think other districts might face or that you have faced in trying to make human rights education a central focus of public education.
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges, either from a district leader perspective or from even just a regular teacher's perspective, is that sometimes people don't see how HRE could be connected to all of the different disciplines that we have in public education. So some people, it's not always as clear to see how can human rights ed connect with math or science or any other field that's out there. And I think that what's unique and what's empowering about human rights close to home is that we're trying to bridge that. We're trying to say that no, it doesn't just have to be in social studies. It doesn't just have to be in these very easily fitted boxes. There is adaptability and there's applicability when it comes to infusing human rights ed into a kindergarten classroom or a third grade STEM experience. That takes work. Sometimes we need to kind of put in the efforts and think a little outside the box of how do we make it adaptable. But I think that for me is a challenge worth taking on. And I think what's really rewarding about that is, especially these last 2 weeks of the Summer Institute, is sitting in partnership with some teachers and saying, okay, it might not be completely clear of how do we bring this in, but let's figure it out together. Let's figure out a way in which we can bring HRE into your third grade classroom and make it relevant and applicable and something that is sustaining for your upcoming students.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Jake. I think there's a misconception that human rights is social studies centric, whereas that it's found in all disciplines, regardless as to content. So science can talk about global warming and the impact of climate change when it comes to human rights issues, and there's all kinds of intersectionality. And so I think certainly the misconception that this is a social studies, a subset of social studies, is limiting. I also think that one of the challenges, and I say this kind of generally looking at social studies in general, because I think both Jake and I have been lucky enough to work in districts that are receptive to human rights education. Clearly in Jake's district with a requirement and that everybody teaches it, and then in my district, the ability to get my course added to a course catalog and that it runs a few sections every year is a reflection of the support that my administration gives. And I don't say that just because if they're listening, they can hear it. I do mean that I think that we're lucky enough to have that. But I think, when you talk about education more broadly, there's I think a wild misconception that human rights are over there problems. They don't have it in this country, that this is something that happens in parts of the world that are not developed to the standards of the United States, and therefore are not things that our students need to learn on an ongoing basis. And I think that becomes a limiter, puts them in a box and says, this is something we teach in global studies or in world studies, and it happens over there to other people who aren't Americans, and that we miss the opportunity to look inwards and do the patriotic thing, which is to critique the country in which we live and say we can be better, and protect these things. Given particularly that the UDHR was driven by an American first lady, and that comes on the heels of what really is an opportunity for the United States to rise as a world power, and yet I think that those connections get missed and become, I think, more overarching barriers, and that it's viewed as being too liberal. That these are ideas because we're caring about others and building others up, that becomes something that becomes political, and as a result, and districts maybe shy away. And then the last point I would make is that it doesn't show up on a standardized test anywhere. And because it isn't tested, districts that are either failing districts or don't meet minimum benchmarks, those things, we're not going to spend time building those things up. And so as a result, we don't put money and resources into into coursework that doesn't match that. And so I think, education broadly, those are barriers to including these things, when it comes to advancing human rights education. If I could just briefly speak to an advantage, though, in the years following COVID, with an understanding that dealing with our SEL needs of students, this is an intersectionality of human rights education that I think is one that we could lean into a little harder, and is an access point as we start to deal with supporting our kids. So I'd kind of add that.
Kevin and Shirin.
With regard to the difficulties of like making human rights education more viable to to communities at large, I'd like to talk about like the positives as well. Shirin and I, as like representatives of the Human Rights Close to Home initiative, we had the opportunity to go to the National Council of the Social Studies. We went to a convention in Philadelphia, and we went there to present our initiative and like talk about how important human rights is in not only social studies but other subjects, and how it can be implemented around the country, not just in the exact same vein as the Human Rights Close to Home initiative, but in their own ways. They can adapt it to their own communities. So we presented about that, us two students, to a bunch of teachers from all across the nation at this convention, and we received, I would say, a very, very positive reception. It was very heartwarming. I was myself approached by a few teachers who asked for my own advice regarding how they could implement this initiative into their own districts. And I was even invited by a teacher from Tennessee to talk with her regarding our initiative on a Zoom meeting of her own. So I'd like to, say there are plenty of positives, and I have seen quite a positive reception, honestly, more than I was expecting around the country to human rights education.
I would have to, agree right there with Kevin. We really have been afforded so many great opportunities being as young as we are, not only, presenting at the National Conference for Social Studies, but also, like Kevin said, other opportunities, such as I think that Zoom was for like Human Rights Day, if I'm not mistaken. So we were, speaking on our experience. And then personally, earlier in the year, I kind of launched a charity, if you will, called Alara, which means She Who Speaks from the Heart in Persian. And it was in light of Mahsa Amini's death and the protests going on in Iran. And so I, got a few friends to kind of help me with, the groundwork. And we got cards printed and a logo. And what we did was we kind of hand beaded Iranian inspired bracelets to sell at school and to sell at the summit and sell, at social gatherings. And we raised over $1,000 in like 2 weeks. So, just right there, it really showed how a community will band together in the name of something very important. And so, that reception right there was amazing. And we also started an Instagram account called alara.jewelry, where we have done a little bit of informational stuff as well to bring awareness. But I kind of want to go back to what Mr. Buckley was saying, how, it is a little bit like there are so many positives, but also, what I've noticed is I'm not sure if maybe this is an American thing or just culturally, a lot of what we're told is to kind of go into industries that are money making, and so that we can kind of establish ourselves and live comfortably. And human rights is definitely not a path that is, for that. So I've spoken with so many amazing women in my community that are passionate about human rights, but because of that aspect of insecurity of, with money and other things, they had to kind of go through the private sector first and make a lot of money, and then they kind of transitioned into nonprofit work. So I think that might be another, stigma attached to the field of human rights is, if you kind of focus on that, you might not be able to support yourself. But I think there are many avenues where, you can, but I think until then, it is probably a cultural thing that we also have to look at in terms of how human rights is perceived.
Well, I think you raised a lot of very important issues. I'd like to bring one more up, and that is the fact that in the United States, too often, in my view, we tend to categorize things as civil rights issues, which could just as easily be examined as human rights issues. In fact, today was the federal designation of the Emmett Till and Mary Mobley Till Monument. And I will guarantee almost that that will be viewed in the newspapers as a civil rights issue. So one of the things that I'm going to pose to you is that how can we change the conversation, the public conversation, to make it more about human rights and less about the rights of this group or that group? Because this gets back to the point that was raised before about, well, it's not in our country, it's over there. But I think it's very clear to all four of you that it is not just over there, it's right here. So what would you suggest about trying to change that public conversation? I'll just give you one example to jog your mind. Bernie Sanders started to do that in the presidential campaign in 2016 when he called healthcare a human rights issue. Very few politicians have actually used human rights as part of their platform. He started to do it, and I think we have him to thank for at least changing some of that. So what are some other ways you might think about moving in that direction?
I'll weigh in on one thing. I think similar to what you said, Bill, I think looking at bread and butter issues in our communities, like healthcare, like food security, right? Things that people very deeply care about. And even at an early age, in our schools, in our homes, starting to have conversations around that this issue, health, food, you name it, is not only an issue that is happening in a faraway country, but it is important, valuable, and critical that we work towards addressing that issue here, very much within the realm of our own community, and putting that language in the back pockets of people that healthcare is a human right. Food security is a human right. It's not just that person or that individual or that one group, but it's collectively all of our basic right and our duty to act and address those particular issues. I think if we start infusing that language early on, even with our little kids, that is maybe not a straightforward way, but I think a better way at getting a wider understanding across our many different realms of our society. So I think language, very intentional language and purposeful language, is really, really important from the get-go.
I mean, I agree with Jake. I continually talk with my own students and just, in conversation when this comes up about the significance of language and why words matter, right? And Bernie Sanders uses that language and now it changes it. But I also think, for many people, as we talked about, there's a misconception that it becomes political. So when politicians use it now, human rights is a political issue. And so I think it needs to come from places that aren't linked to potentially the success of a particular individual trying to attain a goal. Not for anything. I don't disagree with him using it. I think it's wonderful that he used it. But it also, I think, created a political storm around the fact that now the people who were conservative opposed to him could latch on and say, well, that's where maybe where opposition comes from. I think what it highlights is to a degree a bit of a paradox about what our country is about, right? I mean, when we talk about the roots of the UDHR and its central tenet, the United States went to war to protect the rights of people around the world. It was something that we looked to our veterans and said, look what these amazing people did. They protected, those who could not protect themselves, and we hold those standards up. And, that was the greatest generation. And we looked back at those soldiers who did these amazing things and showed compassion. When I teach that particular unit, I show pictures of World War II soldiers helping victims of the Holocaust to safety and wrapping blankets around their shoulders and all of those things that are the qualities of showing dignity and respect to a complete stranger. And now those ideas are no longer ones that are associated with human rights and are looked at, to a degree, down upon as if you're kind of a weaker human being because you show compassion to a stranger. And so I think I wish I had a better answer. I think if Jake and I had better answers, we'd be giving some kind of like Nobel speech at some point because, we clearly have answers that we don't. So I wouldn't pretend to have those. But I do think that it is on some level around changing the way in which the qualities that make a human rights defender amazing and not showing them as signs of weakness, but rather those that we prize and put upon people for whom society is determined are very valuable individuals. And I find the conversation I have in class with kids is about how that has switched, right? Like how is it possible that in the 80 years since World War II, those qualities that were the driving motivators behind the UDHR, we can't ever let this happen again, have now become ones that we look at and go, those are qualities I'm going to mock you for. I find that to be very interesting and the greatest challenge, I think, to promoting human rights more broadly.
Shirin or Kevin, you want to add in? Go ahead, Kevin.
One thing I feel about why like human rights aren't necessarily focused on like in the United States is because I feel like people in general focus on like what is closest to them, and like therefore civil rights being like a national issue are therefore more close to people than human rights, which many people consider to be like a distant thing, a sort of international thing that isn't necessarily in their homes and their communities. So I feel like human rights needs to be pushed as like a local issue just as well as it is international. Like it's a very present factor in our lives, and like they're also like the most accessible to address. The local issues are like the most impactful on our daily lives. Like for example, Hartford, like the capital of Connecticut, our state, is considered to be like the worst state capital in terms of segregation or economic inequality in certain areas. And it's like there are certainly major issues that need to be addressed. And like, things like housing, like safe conditions, equality, these aren't just civil rights. These are human rights. And of course, everyone deserves them. And like, so I feel like it's important to push that all these things in our very communities are tied to human rights.
Yeah, there's also this idea that I want to call upon, which is like humanity and compassion and empathy, which I feel is very much integral to human rights and how one perceives them. Unless you believe that every person is deserving of healthcare, of adequate education, of this and that, this is still going to be sort of like a debate. And so we really need to also realize the difference between equality and equity, making sure and that everybody has a fair shot, and understanding that not everyone can kind of pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and, kind of achieve the American dream on the land of opportunity. We're all, people come from different economic strata, different, situations that, we're not set at an equal playing field. So until we all are, understanding and recognizing and acknowledging that, that is a thing, we have to really make sure that is at the forefront of human rights education, and newer generations are understanding of that, and then I think change can really start to take place.
Well, you're sort of bringing up a very important concept, that is the universality of caring for other people. And I think that's very prominent in all the major ethical principles of world religions. I mean, Paul Gordon Lauren, in his book Vision Seen, which is a history of human rights, has a whole chapter on this, about the foundations that are rooted in these very universal concepts. So that idea, I think, could be one that transcends the politics. But I think it sounds, at least for me, that all of you agree with Tip O'Neill that all human rights issues are local. He said all politics was local, but it sounds like all human rights issues are local to you, and that's pretty clear to me. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next episode concludes our conversation with Chris Buckley, Jake Skrzypiec, Kevin Maysonnet, and Shirin Unvala, 4 human rights education leaders and activists in Connecticut. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, and Deezer. They soon will be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy@hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terugin, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Berering. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.